Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, as Donald Trump reaches closer to a peace deal in Iran, Benjamin Netanyahu appears to have other, more violent plans. Nicola Sturgeon attempts to distance herself from her estranged husband's financial crimes. The BBC's Question Time panel have some moderately spicy takes on AI. And free in a billion. Chinese personalities you really should know by now. This is riffing off a clip whereby two French commentators could only name one Chinese person out of 1.4 billion. I'm Michael Walker, and I'm joined tonight by Banseka Kayembe. Banseka, we're making a habit of this.
Yeah.
Brilliant to have you here on another Friday evening.
Thank you very much for having me again.
If I seem a little bit chirpy today, it's because I'm going on holiday again.
Oh.
I'm going to Spain for 10 days on Sunday. But after this, I will have used up all of my annual leave.
Oh, so, that's a long...
So I'll be here for the rest of the year after this one. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. You can also listen to the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments below. There's a Middle East peace plan on the table, which means Israel is once again, as is now predictable, getting ready to set it on fire. Speaking at an event in a West Bank settlement on Thursday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told the audience that the Israeli military now controls 60% of Gaza. It had, he said, controlled 50%, but then had steadily advanced to gain new territories. And he said that his directive was to go bit by bit until we control, and then the audience called back 100%, and he said, let's start with 70%. So that's Benjamin Netanyahu saying he wants Israel to control 70% of Gaza. Now, in October, Israel signed a ceasefire deal with Hamas. Under that deal, Israel was supposed to withdraw to the so-called yellow line, leaving its military in control of 53% of Gaza's territory. As the ceasefire progressed, the area controlled by Israel was supposed to lessen. However, instead, it's grown. By January this year, Israeli forces had moved the line deeper into Palestinian-controlled areas under the ceasefire in several places. By April, Israel reportedly controlled some 62% of the Strip, but all of that went largely unnoticed by the media. And presumably Netanyahu could have continued his policy of gradually stealing Gaza, just as he's gradually stealing southern Lebanon, without drawing much attention to it. However, Netanyahu's statement comes in the context of something that the Israeli Prime Minister, as well as much of Israeli society, definitely does not want. Now, according to US officials, Washington and Iran have now almost agreed a deal that could result in a 60-day ceasefire, with further negotiations to permanently end that war taking place in the period of that extended ceasefire. Now, Iranian officials haven't yet commented on the memorandum of understanding being drawn up between the Americans and the Iranians, saying that nothing has yet been agreed or confirmed. And on the record, Trump's teams are saying the same. This was US Vice President J.D. Vance speaking on Thursday.
I do think that we've made a lot of progress here. It's very clear that I think the Iranians, they want a deal, and they want to open the Straits of Hormuz. We want them to open the Straits of Hormuz. There are a couple of issues on the nuclear stuff, the highly enriched stockpile, and also the question of enrichment. So, we're going back and forth with them. We do think they're negotiating, at least so far, in good faith, and we're making some progress. Hopefully, we'll continue to make progress. The president will be in a position where he can endorse the agreement, but obviously, that's still TBD.
Later, Vance also describes the deal as very close. So what's in it? Well, various leaks and off-the-record comments have meant that an overall shape to the memorandum has now emerged. One issue is the Strait of Hormuz. Under the deal, Iran will guarantee unrestricted shipping through the strait for the 60-day period, meaning no tolls and no harassment. Iran will also have a 30-day deadline to demine the naval passage. In tandem, the US will end its naval blockade of Iran's ports, and it will waive a number of sanctions on the country, allowing it to trade its oil freely. And that's what's reported to be in this memorandum. Now, oil markets have responded positively to the news, with the price of Brent crude approaching its largest weekly drop in price in months. Also on the table is the very tricky matter of Iran's nuclear enrichment program, but that appears to have been kicked into the long grass with the memorandum listing it as the first topic to be discussed once the 60-day ceasefire is in place. The US had wanted to take control of Iran's 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, but that was rejected by Tehran. Apparently, some in Iran's leadership had considered handing it to a third party, but Iran's new Ayatollah Mujtaba Khamenei reportedly overruled that last week. Other concessions include Iran having access to humanitarian aid and the US committing to discussions around lifting sanctions and unfreezing billions of dollars of Iranian assets. This will all be uncomfortable reading for Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, who was shown the plan on Thursday. Most upsetting will be a potential US and Iranian agreement over Lebanon. So for months, Israel has been steadily advancing northward from the so-called Yellow Line in southern Lebanon, extending the territory already under its control while bombing towns and villages in the region. Now, according to reports, the US-Iran memorandum suggests Israel's war on Lebanon will end once any deal is agreed. In contrast, Netanyahu wants to keep expanding the area Israel controls in Gaza and Lebanon, and he wants the US to renew full-scale attacks on Iran. So more war. Netanyahu wants more war. Surprise, surprise. He has reportedly also been lobbying Trump to make that happen. Sort of say, let's restart the war with Iran. However, Trump's own domestic political sense appears to be pushing him in a different direction, with a source telling CNN this. Israelis were so invested in regime change in Iran that they did not fully comprehend the war could lead to a regime change in DC. Trump saw that the Bibi wagging his dog narrative was killing him, so he had to show he was calling the shots. Of course, if Netanyahu can't get Trump fully on side, pledging to take more of Gaza could instead be viewed as a wrecking operation to undermine any possible ceasefire deal between the US and Iran. After all, why would Iran sign a deal if the US can't provide guarantees that Israel will stick to it? It could also mean, though, the further waning of Israeli influence in Washington. Last week, when asked about Netanyahu's role in the deal, Trump said, quote, "Bibi's a good guy. He'll do what I tell him." And posting on Truth Social late this afternoon, Trump also appeared to indicate the deal with Iran was now very close, outlining some of the terms of the deal and signaling that ships stuck in the strait would soon be leaving the region. Trump implied it could be finalized imminently, ending with this: "I will be meeting now in the Situation Room to make a final determination. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump." That's obviously how he ends all of his Truth Social posts. Banseka, what do you make of all of this? I mean, it's interesting sort of how much of it seems to be sort of tied up in egos. Obviously, there is deep geopolitical analysis that you can make of all of this, which we, have done throughout this war. But also, anyone who makes Donald Trump feel like they're calling the shots isn't necessarily going to be in his good books for very long.
Right. This is a clash of egos here. And I think the clash of egos kind of represents increasingly a clash of voter coalitions and sort of coalition bases that are kind of having less and less alignment, which is interesting. I was asking you earlier on, this 70% number that's kind of been plucked out of the air, it feels quite symbolic as opposed to a specific strategic number. Maybe it is, but it feels like it's somewhat symbolic. Interesting, of course, that people in the crowd then chanted 100%. Maybe that makes Netanyahu look more reasonable. He's positioning himself as a more reasonable person because he only wants 70% and not 100%. So this is a real kind of clash of egos here, and a lot of signaling, I think, from these kind of two big beasts who are trying to kind of protect their interests, and their interests are clashing, I think, more and more.
Well, I mean, what's so outrageous about the 70%? So, I mean, it does sound like it was almost said quite flippantly. But it is also the case that, the ceasefire deal, obviously there's two sort of ceasefires under discussion. There's the one between, the US and Iran, which also involves Israel and Lebanon. And then there's the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. And that ceasefire deal sort of explicitly sort of had in writing that Israel would control 53%. They're at 63%, so they're already breaking it in practice. And then sort of in rhetoric, he's just like, oh yeah, what about 70? Maybe we'll do 70. So it just sort of shows you how much respect, or lack of, obviously, there is for any deal which is reached, which is going to make it difficult for any party to sort of engage or believe in any kind of ceasefire. Obviously, Donald Trump has exactly the same problem, which is the Americans, when they sign deals with Donald Trump as their leader, just rip them up, ignore them the moment it seems politically expedient to do so. So there are a lot of parties who one wouldn't really trust to enter into negotiation with. But obviously the alternative, I suppose, is endless war.
It's not really worth the paper it's written on. It seems like these kind of so-called deals. The goalposts are always moving. Of course, how can anybody have any trust in this? I mean, I don't know whether, from Trump's perspective, whether from his perspective, if on paper I get the deal, that's job done. So if they actually ignore the rules or flagrantly, disobey the rules in the agreement, I don't care because on paper I got the deal. I do think Trump, he does think, and in many ways it's been very useful for him that he thinks in these very simplistic terms. So I'm not saying it like, oh, Trump's an idiot and he doesn't know what he's doing, but he does think in these very kind of concrete...
I mean, he is an idiot and doesn't know what he's doing. I think it'd be fine to say
he's an idiot, but there's a bizarre kind of, I don't want to say genius, but there is a method to the madness.
He has a political genius. I wouldn't say he has a geopolitical one.
Okay. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
That's fair enough. But I mean, I don't know from Trump's perspective, this whole sort of endeavor in Iran has really revealed how much stock he puts in a very narrow understanding of imperialism and a very narrow understanding of how America has done imperialism successfully in the past, which is, of course, it's not just about might. It's not just about we've got more people in our army than you. It's about a cultural influence. It's about building a cultural hegemony. It's about working with, elites on the ground who are in those territories. So you build relationships with them. Then you kind of slowly get into these territories. And he's not interested in any of that finesse. To him, it's just like, I do a deal, I get things done, I've got the bigger army, I get the results. And so in some ways, perhaps that's a very good representation or symbol of where the American empire is at, which is that it's perhaps at a different stage. But I mean, Trump may view this as a victory, regardless of what actually happens on the ground. And certainly rhetorically, he'll be saying, well, we signed a deal, so it's all gravy.
Well, also, I suppose the distance, because it's somewhat frozen. I mean, obviously, it's only been a couple of months, but because there isn't such direct fighting taking place anymore, this has sort of subsided from being at the front of the news agenda all the time, which I suppose Donald Trump hopes means he potentially has more space to make a bunch of concessions without anyone really noticing, which I imagine is what's going to happen at some point, because Iran are still going to be able to control the Strait of Hormuz whenever they want.
Yeah.
Clearly, it might have, like the war on Iran might have receded from the forefront of the minds of Americans. Iranians, I can guarantee, are still very much upset about it and thinking about it all the time. So I think sort of hoping that they will make these enormous compromises and say, oh, we won't have any nuclear enrichment in our country. Not going to happen at this point, right? So what's going to need to happen is that the Americans shift their red lines, Donald Trump declares victory, and then says to Netanyahu, last time when you got me to start this war, it didn't exactly go amazing. So just wind your neck in.
He's got to worry about the price of food in the shops and the things that Americans are already feeling, right?
Keep the man busy. Keep the man's mind busy. Keep distracting that guy.
Nicola, why won't you answer questions from the media in relation to your husband?
That was Nicola Sturgeon, former Scottish First Minister, fleeing questions from the press about her ex-husband, Peter Murrell. That's after Murrell, the former chief executive of the SNP, pled guilty to embezzling £400,000 of party funds earlier this week. Now, Sturgeon, once renowned as the most successful politician in the UK, is now under growing pressure over how much she knew about Murrell's theft. The two were divorced in 2025, but the embezzlement that Murrell has admitted to involved party donations made between 2012 and 2020, a period when they were still married and living together. Now, in her first public appearance since Murrell's admission, Sturgeon told the audience at a literary event in Ireland this. So she said, "This has been probably the worst week of my life. And, the last few years have had some tough ones for me. But this one, I think, surpasses all of them. You're coming to terms with the fact that I spent many years married to somebody that, as it turns out, I obviously didn't know at all. It's a really painful truth to process. And I think I'm only in the very early stages of processing it. And then to be in a position of such public turmoil myself makes that even harder." Now, Sturgeon has consistently denied any knowledge of her former husband's crimes. Given the bizarre and often very unmissable nature of some of the items that Murrell spent money on, some are saying, that's not entirely plausible. Let's look at a partial list of some of the things that he bought. So there's a luxury motorhome for 125 grand. That's a lot of money. And that was apparently parked outside his mother's house. And then there's Free luxury coffee machines were $5.5 grand, so it's a very expensive coffee machine. Lalique salt and pepper grinders. Haven't heard of that brand, but it's presumably luxury because they cost 2.6 grand. So there's 1.3 grand each, for one for the salt, one for the pepper. A bespoke silver wine coaster. I'm not sure what a wine coaster is, if I'm honest, for 3.5 grand. 2 designer watches. Now, I know that watches can be expensive, 9.3 grand. A computerized telescope. Good to know a man has hobbies, 1.2 grand. And a bespoke writing bureau for 3 and a bit grand. That one does sound fairly attractive. Murrell also bought Mont Blanc fountain pens, a jewelry box, 6 Nintendo games. It's getting a bit more lowbrow now. Or games machines, not just the games, the machines. And designer soap dishes. A man of good taste. Murrell also partially financed the purchase of a number of cars with the SNP funds. At the Irish event, Sturgeon addressed the question of how she could have missed all these things, saying this. I think everybody assumes that all of this stuff that it turns out now my former husband was buying, I knew about it, and I just didn't question who paid for it. As recently as Monday, I was reading about things in the newspapers for the first time that I've never seen. I didn't know about it. It wasn't just that I didn't question where it came from. I've never seen it. Sturgeon also blamed their lifestyle for blinding her to those purchases, saying this: I was doing a job, and this is another factor. I was doing a job that had me working around the clock, away from home a lot of the time. Maybe this doesn't reflect well on me. I didn't spend a lot of time in my kitchen, spend any time in my kitchen, but I would never question that some of these things he was buying that I was aware of, he couldn't have afforded because on the basis of our incomes, he could have afforded it. They were on decent incomes. I mean, if a bunch of nice-looking salt and pepper shakers appeared in my kitchen, I probably wouldn't assume my partner was embezzling funds or anywhere, but there we are. Not noticing the existence of an enormous £120,000 motorhome. Slightly harder to explain, although I suppose if they're on big incomes, your very professional boyfriend, husband gets a motorhome. It's not exactly a mega yacht, is it? According to Sturgeon's lawyers, she only became aware of the motorhome in 2023. But archive satellite imagery shows the 24-foot motorhome had been packed in the Dunfermline driveway of her mother-in-law for at least 2 years before that date. Quite possible she didn't like her mother-in-law. Didn't visit her very often, who knows? It was in February of 2023 that Sturgeon also suddenly resigned as First Minister of Scotland and SNP leader. Murrell resigned as the party's chief executive shortly after and was arrested a month later. It emerged afterwards that Operation Branchform, the Scottish police investigation into embezzlement of SNP funds, had begun approaching senior SNP figures earlier that year. And then in June of 2023, Sturgeon was also arrested. You don't want that to happen if you've just resigned as First Minister. After a nearly 2-year-long investigation, Murrell was charged while Sturgeon was cleared of any involvement in the theft by Police Scotland in 2025. At the time, she said this to the press.
As I have said to all of you many times, I have done nothing wrong. In times like this, you find resilience you sometimes don't know you have, and you find strength that you don't know you have. So I've certainly experienced that over the last couple of years. I'm a stronger person today than I was when this kicked off. But that said, I wish none of it had happened.
To find out what this all means for Scottish politics, I spoke to Laura Webster, editor of the Scottish National, earlier today. I began by asking her how embarrassing this all is for the SNP.
It's pretty embarrassing. I mean, to have somebody so senior take £400,000 out of the party over the course of, about 10 years. I mean, that is extremely humiliating. And I think there are big questions for the party on why nobody noticed, first of all, and also when people started asking questions around 2020, 2021, they were very decisively shut down by the senior people in the party. And there is a video going around of Nicola Sturgeon telling an NEC meeting that the party's finances had never been better, when in actual fact, we know how much money was being extracted by Peter Murrell for effectively nonsense. It's not like he was using this money for, these incredible massive purchases. It was like salt and pepper shakers and Le Creuset stuff, which he could afford anyway on his massive salary. So it is incredibly embarrassing. There are massive questions about the S&P's internal governance that need to be answered, and especially on the point around whether any public money was in fact embezzled as well. We need to know answers to that too.
People outside of Scotland will have heard of Nicola Sturgeon. Peter Murrell, I suppose, is a less familiar figure. So I suppose, could you just sort of introduce who he is? So he was sort of head of the S&P as a party, but who is this guy that decided to risk everything for a mobile home and some expensive salt shakers?
Yeah, it's hard to get your head around, isn't it? And that's actually the big question that Murray Foote, who was Peter Murrell's successor as S&P chief executive, has been asking this week. He's saying the two main questions are, what did Nicola know? And of course, why did Peter Murrell do this? So as you say, Peter Murrell was the chief executive of the S&P for quite a long period of time. We know that the embezzlement was going on between 2010 and 2022, so really quite an extended period. Him and Nicola Sturgeon have been or were married up until 2025 when they separated. He's always been kind of a in the background guy, not a big media facing guy. You would see a picture of him every few years when there was an election, and Nicola and him would go and vote together at the polling station. And that was about it. There's a lot of questions that we don't know the answers to about Peter Murrell. And in fact, there's going to be a court date next week, kind of like a fact-finding session about some more information about what has been going on. Of course, because he pled guilty, we wouldn't be getting a trial, and a lot of the information that people might want to know about wouldn't be coming out. So hopefully this court date will give us some of that, and the National will have somebody in the court and we'll be bringing people all the details that we find out.
And is it credible that Nicola Sturgeon didn't know? I mean, her excuse that she doesn't cook very much hasn't gone down particularly well. I mean, at the same time, if you see some expensive salt shakers, are you really going to know that they were expensive? I mean, what's your view on all of this?
I think it's not a black and white situation, and until there's more information out there that gives us more solid evidence about what Nicola Sturgeon knew, I don't want to make any sweeping generalizations. What I would say is that Nicola Sturgeon and Peter Murrell were both earning a really significant amount of money. And so Le Creuset cookware showing up in your kitchen is not necessarily going to be like a red flag. You're not going to think, oh, where did he get the money for that? The answer is he gets the money from being the chief executive of the S&P, and you know his salary because you are, one, married to him, and B, his boss. So I think that the idea that Nicola should have been asking questions around the items that he was purchasing, it doesn't really quite check out for me. I think that's maybe too speculative. However, Nicola Sturgeon definitely has questions to answer around what she knew about the camper van. There's lots of people suggesting that the camper van, which was at her mother-in-law's house in Fife, may well have been visible at times that she was visiting. So she needs to explain what's going on with that, because that was, of course, the largest purchase that Peter Murrell made by far. Besides that, I think, she's been very emphatic this week that she feels like she's been deceived. She feels like she's kind of been a victim in this situation. And I don't think that we should forget that it is often women in these situations where a husband has kept financial secrets and it has come back to haunt the wife. It definitely wouldn't be the first time that there'd been a dynamic like that. I think, we have a lot more questions to find the answers to, but some of this I would say, hysteria around, Nicola Sturgeon must have known because she had this DVD that was on the list of items that were purchased by Peter Murrell. I mean, that's patently ridiculous. In a relationship, in a marriage, you don't necessarily ask where the money has come from for every single small purchase. So it doesn't quite check out for me. Not everybody who's trying to find answers here is coming from a place of good faith. There are some political actors within the S&P, within the independence movement, who are motivated not by trying to find justice for S&P members, who, of course, it was their money that was used, but by trying to put down Nicola Sturgeon, by, there's factions, of course, everything with Alex Salmond and Alaba, like that very much still exists within Scottish politics. And then you've got people like Russell Finlay from the Scottish Conservatives, who are just being so exaggerated in their language, like accusing Nicola Sturgeon of organised crime tactics because she went into a police interview and said no comment. That's obviously standard legal advice. And so trying to turn that into something really sinister, I think, is incredibly unfair. I've been saying there's a little bit of Nicola derangement syndrome going on. And I think people need to kind of get that under check and see this as a much bigger issue that isn't just about what Nicola was aware of.
So I should make a correction to my intro to that, because we've got a new producer called Jack. He's Scottish, and he's just told me that in Scotland, a fancy motorhome is equivalent to a super yacht. So when I said it's not exactly a super yacht, that was inaccurate. When BBC Question Time was announced on X this week, it got a lot of hate. It was a AI special. The lineup included Labour's Darren Jones, a Tory shadow minister, Mo Gaudat, who's an ex-Google employee, Laura Gilbert from the Tony Blair Institute, and the CEO of an AI company, and the AI company, sort of AI video explainers. In particular, it was the inclusion of the Tony Blair Institute that got a lot of people riled up. Leader of the Greens, Zach Polanski, said this: Oracle's £250 million gift to the Tony Blair Institute appears to buy you an entire Question Time episode. Oracle, owned by Larry Ellison, he gave money to the Tony Blair Institute. Zach saying now they're getting all this publicity. Carol Cadwallader had a similar point. So she said, so you know what BBC Question Time did with Farage? They're now doing it with AI. This so-called expert panel on AI is a disgrace, not one critical voice. Gilbert works for Tony Blair to promote AI. Jones is government chief AI booster and Blair flunky. Ripabelli is industry. Gaudat is ex-industry, and for balance, a Tory MP. Now, I think some of the anger was because people had missed that Mo Gaudat, despite having worked for Google, is actually very critical of the business model of AI companies, and spends a lot of time warning about the technology itself, existential risk, et cetera, et cetera. He also seems pretty left-wing. So on his YouTube, his most recent interviews are with Jeffrey Sachs and Grace Blakely. Anyway, as Aaron Bastani likes to say, I don't mind being a contrarian. In fact, sometimes I quite like it. And when I watched the Question Time special, despite all the anger on X, I thought it was pretty good. Right? They debated loads of angles about the technology, job losses, existential risk. They talked about sort of technological sovereignty, about how we need to develop more of this stuff in the UK. It was the conversation about AI and therapy that I thought was the most interesting. This audience intervention sparked off that debate.
I don't know the long and the big grammar you were saying, but for me, my lived experience, AI has really been helpful in helping me to heal faster and quicker from depression and anxiety. With your traditional therapists, they are kind of blank and bland. They don't. You're in depression and you don't have the mental space to articulate anything, but they want you to find those insights yourself. That's not ChatGPT. ChatGPT understands me. It gives me, instant, viable answers to what I'm asking. And because I've been in a relationship, not sexually, but, it understands my emotions and it's able to articulate and help me find those answers and solutions. Unlike your regular therapists, because of ethics and professionalism, there is really not much they can tell you, so you're not quoting them. But with ChatGPT, it's leaving all those boxes, the tick, are you, for the last 2 weeks, how have you been feeling? Doesn't do all that. It goes straight to the point. So for me, AI
has really helpful.
Yeah, very.
You want to come
I mean, there are definitely huge advantages and benefits, and some of it is quite equalising because therapy costs money. We have mental health backlogs that are very difficult to solve because they're very expensive.
The accessibility, I could be in bed, wandering in my thoughts. I wake up, open my laptop, I'm chatting with
Absolutely.
Where would I get a therapist at that time of the night? The long queue and all that, which is not helping my mental well-being.
So I thought that was so interesting. And lots of people were complaining that the panel would be AI boostery, but actually sort of the two most positive comments came from the audience. So there was that lady you just heard there, and then there was another gentleman who sort of said he'd sort of struggled to sort of get gainful employment and struggled his whole life. And then sort of through chatting to one of, I don't know if it was Claude or ChatGPT or whatever, he kind of self-diagnosed as ADHD, then got an official ADHD diagnosis, and now is doing like a master's degree in AI because he can finally concentrate. So there were a number of people sort of in the audience who are saying they've had a good experience. Obviously, there were people who also had a bad experience. When it comes to AI and therapy, I think, to be honest, it seems like most people I know give their sort of interpersonal problems, sometimes I get a second opinion from AI. It seems just like super normal now. I do know one person who, got into a bit of a psychosis with it. I know other people who found it very helpful. But clearly this is like, that woman in the audience, her experience is now very common. Let's take a look at what I think probably the most interesting person on the panel said. Mo Godat, he's the ex-Google exec. He had an interesting answer.
Two topics, one therapy and one loneliness. On therapy, I'll have to say, regardless of it's AI or it's a human therapist, the number one impactful reason for a successful therapy session is compatibility between the two. And you may have found a place where you're able to communicate reasonably well with ChatGPT without it telling you, oh my God, you're amazing. I love everything that you do, which is very typical ChatGPT, right? But others might be very vulnerable in those places where, we have seen cases where ChatGPT specifically encouraged people to take their own life, right? Now, on the other hand, when it comes to loneliness, I think the real big sigh here is that two wrongs don't make a right. Right? What we've done over the internet revolution and the early implementations of AI is, unfortunately, we have taught AI to manipulate us into outsourcing our human connection through a tiny little screen. And now we're saying, now that we sort of messed up on our ability to connect to humans because we're so stuck to that screen, instead of fixing it by saying, go out and meet real humans and find real human connection, we want to stick you more in the screen, not even to a human, but to a simulation of a human. Very dangerous.
I think that was just very smart, very well put. It sort of goes, I think we've done a segment on it before, actually, Mark Zuckerberg sort of talking about how AI is going to be so brilliant at solving the loneliness crisis. And in that segment, we obviously talked about how Mark Zuckerberg was instrumental in creating the loneliness crisis by making everyone addicted to their screens instead of meeting people in real life. The evidence about this is overwhelming. Just the last couple of weeks, actually, there's been lots of discourse about whether it's smartphones that are the reason why people are less inclined to start families because they're meeting people less. They're pairing up less because they're just constantly looking at their screen. So I 100% agree with that the idea, we'll get something on the screen to save us from the loneliness induced by the screen is, there's something a bit dystopian about it. Also, obviously, it goes without saying, if you are considering getting therapy from a chatbot, be very alert to the fact that they are sycophantic, that it's not going to challenge you, that it doesn't have any professional experience. Like, it probably is much better to get a real therapist. Although I can see even in the comments, there are lots of people saying, I don't really like speaking to a therapist and I don't mind speaking to the chatbot, which again, I don't think is entirely unreasonable. There was someone in the audience who I think had a very sort of balanced take on this. And actually, she got one of the biggest round of applause on the program.
I work in the area of cancer coaching. And we actually been trialling, I was involved in trial of a beta phase of an AI version of cancer coaching. And it's interesting.
When you say cancer coaching, what do you mean?
So people who have been diagnosed with cancer and who, for example, especially in the workplace, so we support them through the cancer journey in the workplace primarily. And some organizations are thinking, well, we can outsource that to an AI version of cancer coaching rather than using a human being who has lived experience of cancer who can help them and support them. And it's seeing it's more productive. But when we've seen in the beta version of this, I mean, it's basically a chatbot. So I don't think it's either an or. I think having something that could be developed in the middle of the night when a question comes up to help the initial, but it has to be co-developed. So I think AI
to have both things.
Yeah, I think AI can augment the experience, but you still need a human being who understands the lived experience and actually can support the human being. It cannot replace that.
So Julia, are we solving loneliness or normalising isolation?
I thought that really sort of nicely brought the point together in a way, because she was saying, yes, the AI chatbot for the particular job she does, which is cancer coaching. I hadn't heard of that job before that either, but it sounds like a very important thing to do. It could be useful for people to have also a chatbot to discuss this with, but if they're just getting it from chatbot, they're going to lose the most important, powerful part of the program, which is the human relationship with someone who has experienced cancer as well. So you form a human bond with someone who's had a similar experience, who will also have had some professional training, so they're much more responsible than just something that just pumps out what it thinks you want to hear. And then she adds, the important point, which is that businesses who pay for her, I don't know who she does it for, but whoever employs her, who pays for that company or service, are now deciding they can save money by going to a chatbot. So if we just leave this to the free market, instead of having AI sort of augment human therapy, it will end up replacing it because of how costs work. Banseka, first of all, I don't know if you watched the whole question time.
I didn't. I was going to caveat that by saying I've only seen a few clips here and there.
That's fine, but from the clips I've shown you, are you on my team or are you on Twitter's team?
I find a lot of this desperately sad. The therapy stuff in particular, I found, really disheartening. I take your point about Mo, is it? Who has a more critical angle on AI than some of the other people on the panel. Was it mentioned, by the way, when the person from the Tony Blair Institute, were they framed in any way as having links to AI or links to AI
I don't think
firms?
they mentioned that.
And I
Tony
do
Blair
think that's
Institute was funded by Larry Ellison, which
that's
they
a
probably should have done.
significant omission, I think. I mean, I was looking at the numbers this week in light of the recent statement Tony Blair made about intervening with the Labour Party. They've had at least, 130 million?
Oh, yes, a hell of a lot of money.
Heck of a lot of money, I've got to say.
You can't really talk about the Tony Blair Institute without talking about that connection.
And I think that's part of some of the argument, I think, about people talking about manufacturing consent for a particular view on AI, right? That's not critical enough. I think that's really egregious, actually. I pay my license fee. I really don't like the fact that I'm contributing to a show, that doesn't provide that kind of background, just very clear and obvious.
The content of it, though, was very critical. They were all quite critical. Even the Tory politicians said, we failed on social media. We didn't regulate it properly. And now we've seen the consequences it has on kids, and we need to do better this time.
But there's a step before the introduction of smartphones and the proliferation of the online world, which is austerity as well.
I don't really buy it.
We disagree.
Yeah. I'm very much against austerity, but I think if you're looking at the complete transformation that happened from that period onwards, closing a few youth centres doesn't add up to it. Like if you think about how my life experience has changed since 2010, and because also austerity really, really harmed sort of the most vulnerable people in society. Now that's what was so morally egregious about it. But what we're seeing now in terms of falling birth rates, in terms of higher anxiety, in terms of more loneliness, instead of not hanging out with people, not meeting partners, that isn't disproportionately affecting more vulnerable people. That is across the board. And how has everyone's life changed? So everyone's life has changed because we are looking at a screen 3 to 4 hours a day. So I think the austerity argument is too neat.
I think
for
that's
people of a
part
certain
of it.
political persuasion.
It may not explain all of it, and I do think there is, of course, something inherently addictive built into these platforms that we are addicted to, like a drug of sorts. But I do think that, I was at a discussion actually this week with young people, because there's obviously conversations about should we ban social media for young people. Most of them were against it, vast majority of them, and that came up over and over again where they said, look, we've got nowhere else to go. These weren't like necessarily the poorest kids, these were kids from middle-class backgrounds where they just said, we haven't got the money to go anywhere. Our parents aren't going to, fund this. Where will we go if we're banned from
Why used to go
social
sit in a field? Like do you know what I mean? It's like if you don't have a screen to look at, I don't want to do back in my day, but it is like if you're in a social world where people aren't looking at a screen, stuff kind of does happen, right? You go sit in a field and get drunk. People have stopped drinking. That's probably a problem.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely economically linked. And that's not just
No,
younger
that's
people.
the smartphone. That's not economic. People can afford to get pissed. Getting pissed is really cheap. Keep people, like the White Star, White Claw cider, I can't remember what it's called now, thank God. But whatever that strong cider was that, I drank when I was 16, 17. White Claw's different. It's called White Lightning.
Okay.
It's Jack to the rescue again.
I'm not a big drinker.
White Lightning, it's so cheap. Like, I did not need much money to get drunk in a field as a teenager.
Drink somewhere with a bit of ambience or something.
Well, you're not allowed to anyway if you're under 18. And
I'm just meaning in general.
Yeah,
because drinking is falling across the board. There was some FT data on this. It's not just younger people.
I think that's got a lot more to do with Instagram and all of that than sort of people can't afford to go to pubs. I just don't think it does the explanatory work.
I think it's part of it.
Because rich kids who definitely can afford to go to pubs are also anxious and not and lonely.
And sober?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. The other thing I wanted to say as well about the whole thing about therapy and people finding it easier to talk to ChatGPT, and I can totally see why. I do worry about this promise that comes with AI, which comes with other aspects of technological innovation as well, and is sort of key to capitalism, which is a kind of frictionless society, a kind of, well, this is the easiest thing for me, so this is best for me. But that doesn't always fit neatly with what's required. And I do think sometimes therapy can be really difficult. There's lots of different types of therapy, by the way, as well. Obviously, some of it is just talking and counselling, but you've also got CBT. And, CBT is really challenging and difficult. And I do worry that people want to go for something that feels easy, and I understand why, but that might not necessarily be the best long-term solution for you. So I do worry about what we're sold here. Like, this is this frictionless experience. It's easy. You can pick it up anytime. And there are ways to integrate that in where I understand it. Of course, it's very attractive to pick up an AI bot and be able to chat anytime about your thoughts. If you wake up in the middle of the night and you've got thoughts racing around your head, but there's something about the human touch. And I think there's something about that human connection that provides a kind of necessary friction. It's like these two kind of rough stones rubbed together to create a smoother gem. And I do worry about some of these conversations with AI. I was really disheartened to hear that lady's comment. I hope she's all right, obviously, and I'm happy she's got some help. But it does worry me, some of those comments.
And also, I mean, you don't want to be presumptuous about anyone's experience or
of
future.
Course.
But listening to that, I wasn't exactly confident that this was all going to go well in the long term. Like, it did seem a bit like this isn't necessarily a sustainable solution.
No.
Anyway, I agree with everything you've said. I agree. I'm just as skeptical about AI as you are, I think. I suppose one thing the social media thing has made me more is like paternalistic. I feel like we do kind of need, as a society, to say that sometimes we need saving from ourselves. And that sort of social media is an example of that. And the thing that worries me about there's plenty of things that worry me about AI, but we're not going to talk about the existential risk again today. But is that social media, right, clearly has, I think, had a net negative effect on society if you sort of look at it all. And no one has been able to do anything about it. And it's sort of like if the moment we started recognizing those problems, the state said, okay, let's do something about this. This has gone too far. And then we sort of say, let's take a step back. Let's meet in real life more. Let's put some sort of time limit on this. Let's sort of make sure that scrolling short video, you get to some limit after you've watched 4. Like, I'm into like the smoking ban and stuff. I think do all of that with social media. But the state has been so unable to do that if AI goes horribly wrong, I'm not that confident they're going to be able to have the agency to do anything about it. Like, to go back to China again, obviously I love talking about China, but they have a thing where sort of like they let technology grow, and then if they don't like the consequence, boom. Like they did that with private tuition and sort of education tech. Put lots of people out of business, by the way, because overnight Xi Jinping just said, decision, we're banning private tuition. And that's because he thought that individually every parent wanted to get it for their kid, but as a society as a whole, this was causing an arms race, which meant that kids were just constantly in tuition. Parents were wasting all their money on private tutors. So there was a collective action problem, and he said, look, we're going to solve it. Banned. And I do kind of feel like I want the state to be able to do that with social media and with, not ban it, but sort of come in and say, you guys have got a problem. There's a collective action problem. The equilibrium we found ourselves at is not working. Let's do something about it as a society. I think it could be really popular as well.
I mean, I don't know how China makes decisions like that. Is that a piece of consultative Leninism, I think it's called?
It's like a 7-person Politburo.
Right.
So, I mean, they'll presumably...
Because they like to say, oh, we do consult.
Yeah, I'm sure they would have got some of their local party officials to talk to people, but obviously it's not done democratically. It's that they'll do a bit of consultation, put some feelers out.
We don't have the
and then the
mechanisms
7-person
for that.
Politburo does it. I think with a little bit of bravery, you maybe could, right? Because I think that people are really... If one thing you got from that question time audience is that people are really skeptical about this, really angry about this, and people want political leadership. So I think, people could...
step up. We are in a kind of strange window of the Labour Party really kind of in a bit of a bizarre place. They want to make sure that they, keep a kind of stable government together. And so that there is kind of, in a sense, this weird window where maybe they might be up for things. But I don't think I support the social media ban ultimately, but that perhaps there is...
What do you think should happen?
I mean,
because I know you think about this quite a lot.
Certainly more regulation. Absolutely. The rampage, I think that social media firms have been able to sort of run in our lives has to be regulated. It has to be, there has to be a stop on it. I do disagree with you. Ultimately, I think it's in the state's interest to build alternatives outside of the online world. Yes, make the online world better, but let's also have more for people in real life as well.
I want to do that as well. I'm not going to say don't build more parks.
I know you're not pro austerity, obviously, but I do think that is an important part of the equation. And I do wonder, how much young people actually genuinely need real kind of socializing and coaching into that kind of a more in real life world. They're so used to screens. There's, even just being in a room full of young people this week, it feels like a novelty to see that. They don't have any experience of youth clubs and that type of stuff. It's a real novelty or a privilege now to be involved in that type of stuff. So those alternatives make real life good again.
Make real life good again. But I feel like to make real life good again, you have to solve the collective action problem of the smartphone, which is what is undermining real life in so many instances, is what I think. We've got some information. White Lightning was a brand of English white cider produced from the early 1990s to 2009.
2009, so didn't survive the crash.
It's gone out of...
oh my God, it was a consequence of Lehman Brothers.
Maybe people can't afford to get drunk anymore because they don't make white... Maybe we need bring back White Lightning.
How old are you then? 2009 it went out and you're talking about it.
No, that would have been my teenage drinking years because I would have turned 18 in... I was born in 1989, so I would have turned 18 in 2007.
Okay.
Something like that.
Oh my God, you turned an adult just as the world just went... Meow.
Yeah, no, I think I got a few good years in before it all went downhill. All right, final story. Guess what I'm going to talk about next? China makes up 1/5 of the world's population, 1/5 of the world's economy, and is the leading force in most of the technologies of the future, be they robots, batteries, electric cars. However, Western commentators know extraordinarily little about the country that will shape the 21st century, as demonstrated in this viral clip from French TV.
Qui peut aujourd'hui citer, je vous pose la question à tous, qui peut citer autour de cette table le nom, c'est la question que pose Gilles Gressani, qui peut aujourd'hui citer le nom de 3 Chinois vivants?
Et c'est tout.
Qui peut?
Xi Jinping. 3 Chinois vivants.
3 Chinois vivants. 3 personnes chinoises vivantes.
Mais le président
Xi Jinping,
oui, vous voulez les noms,
c'est déjà un. Xi Jinping, voilà.
Oui.
Vous voyez? Vous voyez?
Non, mais ça dit quelque chose de fondamental.
Ah oui, la vache.
Non, mais je pense que ça dit quelque chose de fondamental parce que
le grand sculpteur.
Parce qu'en fait, on vit en réalité avec des représentations mentales qui sont celles du XXe siècle, du début du XXe siècle. On vit toujours un 2000 alors qu'on est en fait en réalité beaucoup plus proche à 2050.
C'est pas fou.
Et en 2026, la Chine, c'est la moitié de ce qui compte en géopolitique et en économie. Bon, voilà. Et donc, il y a un problème quand effectivement des personnes cultivées qui s'intéressent aux affaires internationales, qui lisent la presse, au fond, ont du mal à se représenter l'existence de 3 figures chinoises. Donc,
that was France's leading news program, and they were discussing a new book out about geopolitics. And the 2 pundits, so not the author of the book, but the 2 sort of pundits who were there to discuss politics in general, were asked to name 3 Chinese living people, 3 living Chinese people. Now, neither could name 2, right? So they could only name Xi Jinping and no one else, not a single other living Chinese person. Now, reactions to that clip have fallen into 2 camps. So one side says this shows the myopia of Western pundits who lack curiosity about the rest of the world. As I say, they only care about what's going on in the West. They just sort of talk about China as if it's this bad place and don't learn anything about it. Now, that's not implausible. I think that's entirely possible. The other side suggests that it speaks to a failure of the Chinese state. So the argument goes that control of culture by the party means the Chinese have failed to generate films, TV, music, books with proper international appeal, and they're thereby lost out in terms of soft power. Now, it's also the case that in the political realm, without competitive elections, fewer politicians get recognition in the international sphere. So if you to ask someone, name 3 Americans, they might name 3 presidents who are living. Xi Jinping, obviously been in power for 15 years. There wasn't an election. You don't know who the losing candidate was. Now, personally, I think it's a bit from column A and a bit from column B. I don't think we really need to argue about that. I wanted to do something slightly different with this section because whatever the explanation, it doesn't seem ideal. So to help you, if you ever find yourself on a news panel and you're required to name 3 living Chinese people, we're going to do a profile of free living Chinese people who I thought might be of interest to Novara media viewers. Well, sorry, we're going to begin with Jack Ma. This is, I think, China's most famous businessman on the international stage. I was surprised I didn't manage to mention him, to be honest. One of the most famous Chinese people in the world. Founder of Alibaba Group, which is an e-commerce company, completely ubiquitous in China. Everyone in the country will have Alipay on their phone, which is a payment app. Ma has a rags to riches story. So he came from humble origins, failed his university entrance exams twice, was rejected from jobs at KFC. In his mid-30s, he was an English teacher, earning the equivalent of $12 a month. But after a trip to the US in the 1990s and his first encounter with the internet, he formulated a plan to build an e-payment system to link up Chinese producers with buyers in the West. He saw a gap in the market, and he decided to fill it. Now, this is a legendary clip that I'm going to show you. He's giving an investment pitch to friends before the 1999 Alibaba IPO.
华业所要瞄准的对象不是国内展的，而是国际展的。我们所有的竞争对手不在于中国，而在于美国的硅谷。第二个呢，我想就是我们要学会硅谷人的一种拼劲。如果说我们是早上8点钟下班，8点钟上班，5点钟下班，这个不是搞高科技。这个绝对不是我们阿里巴巴能成功。如果是我们有这种精神，反正我上班了，反正8点钟上班，5点钟下班了 ，OK， 赶紧去其他地方。人家美国人强就强他的硬件，强就强他的系统基础，这方面确实比你高。但是玩信息玩软的，中国人的脑袋绝不比人长。我们在座的所有的人的脑袋绝不比任何人长。这就是我们敢跟美国人斗的劲。
It's amazing. Just like kind of looks like a home video of him pitching a company to some friends. He ends up being worth about $27 billion. Because compete with the Americans, Jack Ma did. His company was central in building a base for Chinese tech that had independence from Silicon Valley. So he said, we can compete with Silicon Valley. We can build our own companies. They did, something we haven't managed very well in the UK. So they don't use American payment systems in China. They use their own payment systems. We use the American ones. Jack Ma was also famous for being an irreverent character. So at Alibaba's 18th birthday celebrations, he performed as Michael Jackson to 40,000 assembled employees. However, he dropped from public view in 2020 after he criticized the Chinese government for being too risk-averse when it came to financial regulation. This was also amid China's crackdown on big tech, which the government judged was running out of its control. The government then cancelled an IPO of his fintech firm, Ant Financial. And Jack Ma moved to Tokyo to lecture on sustainable farming. Really interesting guy. Jack Ma now, though, appears to be back in the government's good books. He returned to China in 2023 after being persuaded by China's premier, Li Qiang. He was pitched at an event with Xi Jinping last year. So that's character number one, embodies China's capitalist dynamism. Also, it's entrepreneurs taking inspiration from the West and saying we can do it even better ourselves. Also a story of how China, unlike the West, has a state which can click its finger and, I suppose, bring its power to bear on tech executives, however rich they might be. I should say, with not very much accountability. We shouldn't sort of say this is brilliant and yes, we should also do the same, but interesting nonetheless. This is Wang Huning, who I'm not surprised the French pundits didn't mention. He's not at all famous in the West. In China, though, his significance can't really be overstated. Wang has been the leading ideologist in the Communist Party since the 1980s. A former academic, he's advised the last 3 Communist Party leaders. Since 2017, he sits on the 7-member Politburo Standing Committee. So that's the most powerful body in the country. They're the ones who make sort of the final decisions. He's the 4th or 5th ranking member of that standing committee. He's a proponent of what was known as neo-authoritarianism. So the idea that a nation as big and poor as China needed a firm hand to push through modernization before it could consider becoming a democracy. He was inspired by other Asian countries like South Korea and especially Singapore. In a 1995 interview, he said this. So he says, in a place without central authority or a place where central authority has become weakened, the country would be mired in a state of division and chaos. A strong central authority is the fundamental guarantee for achieving rapid and stable development at a relatively low cost during the process of modernization. 4 years before he gave that comment, in 1991, Sort of 1991, he visited the United States and wrote his observations in a book called America Against America. It was a book which celebrated America's technological progress compared to China, but also highlighted the contradictions he saw in the system, which he thought made the entire system vulnerable. And this really came back into prominence after the Capitol riots in 2021, so when it did look like American democracy was collapsing. This is part of a review from former analyst at the Rand Corporation, David Ronfeld, of that book, America Against America. He says, a key theme is that American society, while offering much to admire, is so fraught with individualism, so lacking in spiritual community and cultural security, its youth too ignorant of traditional Western values, too prone to nihilism, that American democracy risks decaying into a war with itself, hence the title. Given its excessive individualism, Chinese collectivism will surely prove the superior way to go. Reading America's major conservative thinkers back then, notably Alan Bloom and Charles Moynihan, heavily influenced Wang's views about America. Today they seem prophetic, and they persist in shaping China's strategy towards the US, perhaps for years to come, if Xi extends his stay in power with Wang alongside as ideological leader of the new authoritarians. Now, the reason I'm reading you a review of the book instead of the book is I have to admit I haven't yet read the book. I'll put it on my reading list. Sounds very, very interesting. I think why this guy is very interesting, because we know Xi Jinping, we know the political leaders. We discuss sort of the ideology of China less. And I think what this sort of puts forward is the extent to which people understate the social conservatism of other countries, and also sort of the nationalism. Because I think often when people in the UK sort of talk about Western values, yada, yada, we assume they're sort of like far-right xenophobes. There are lots of sort of countries in the developing world where the political leaders come here and they say, you guys really need to love your country a bit more. You need some kind of national culture, because otherwise the whole thing is going to fall apart. There's something sort of particular about societies like Britain, where it's sort of high status to say the country's rubbish and we don't have anything that we have in common. And then the Chinese come over and say, you guys need a myth to organize around. I don't know if this is going to work. Finally, but definitely not least, we have Tu Yaoyao. She's amazing. She's a Nobel Prize winning Chinese malariologist and pharmaceutical chemist. She's currently 95 years old. And as I say, amazing story. In 1967, during the Vietnam War, Ho Chi Minh, so obviously the leader of North Vietnam, requested China's help in developing an anti-malaria drug. This was because malaria was affecting Vietnamese soldiers on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, so obviously the northern Vietnamese soldiers. The type of malaria predominant in southern Vietnam was resistant to chloroquine, which is what's widely used for malaria treatment outside of Southeast Asia. Tu Yaoyao was asked to head up the team to develop the treatment. And this is what's really interesting. She turned to the insights of traditional Chinese medicine. So this is from her Wikipedia. No shame in quoting from Wikipedia, because it's the best website on the internet. Scientists worldwide had screened over 240,000 compounds without success. In 1969, Tu, then 39 years old, had an idea of screening Chinese herbs. She first investigated the Chinese medical classics in history, visiting practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine all over the country on her own. She gathered her findings in a notebook called A Collection of Single Practical Prescriptions for Anti-Malaria. Her notebook summarized 640 prescriptions. By 1971, her team had screened over 2,000 traditional Chinese recipes and made 380 herbal extracts from some 200 herbs, which were tested on mice. She's gone back through ancient Chinese sort of recipes and tested them. Then she finds that one compound was particularly effective, sweet wormwood, which was used for intermittent fevers, sort of in ancient Chinese medicine, which is a hallmark of malaria. As Tu also presented the project at this project seminar, its preparation was described in a recipe from 1,600-year-old traditional Chinese herbal medicine text, Emergency Prescriptions, kept up one's sleeve. In 1972, she and her colleagues obtained the pure substance and named it Qinghasu, or Artemisinin in English. This substance has now saved millions of lives, especially in the developing world. So this is really, really cool. She's tasked with this sort of in the middle of the Vietnam War. The North Vietnamese, the Vietnamese communists are getting malaria. They need a specific malaria drug, which is to this sort of chloroquine-resistant strain. She says, Western scientists have gone through so many compounds and none of it seems to work. Let's go to ancient Chinese wisdom, but then apply the techniques of Western medicine to it. She gets something. She wins the Nobel Prize. after saving millions of lives. Obviously, saving millions of lives, more important than winning the Nobel Prize. But when she did win that prize in 2015, ITV included this clip in a news report about
This demonstrates we have a precious wealth from our ancient time, she said after winning the award. Just as the late Chairman Mao said, traditional Chinese medicine is a treasure vault.
So, free, famous, living Chinese people. I don't want to just be on here saying, like, oh, those pundits are so dumb. If there is a problem in society, instead of complaining, we should try and solve it. So if there are too many pundits that can't name free, living Chinese people, send them this clip. Banseka.
Yeah, I feel very well educated, actually. That was a nice bit of an introduction to...
That's what I'm trying to do with these shows, less heat, more light.
Yeah, very good. Counter the instincts that social media embeds in us as journalists.
Do you think it matters that you have pundits that can't name free, living Chinese people?
I think it does. I mean, there's two stories here, right? Of course, one of it is a kind of hubris inbuilt into any empire, and there's a hubris there in sort of Western countries where our culture is kind of reigned as dominant, and there's a lack of curiosity. There's certainly a lack of curiosity about what China's doing economically. Tony Blair, for example, when he was talking about China's emissions earlier in his statement this week, he actually admitted how well they were doing on green technology, for example. So there's a bit of mythologizing and sometimes warping. So that's part of the story. But I also do think there is something here to say about the way in which China probably hasn't done kind of cultural hegemony yet, could be coming. Maybe some of that stuff is happening already and we don't know it. There was the China maxing stuff, wasn't there, at the start of the year? The dominance of TikTok. I'm wondering if there's a generational angle to this. Those newsreaders were a bit older. I wonder what younger people's exposure perhaps potentially to sort of Chinese culture is. Maybe it's not through individuals, but perhaps culture is omnipresent, isn't it? It's anything and everything.
So my understanding, and I might be wrong, this is very unscientific. My understanding, China's soft power in a way is increasing over the past year or so, but it's not really about celebrities or cultural production. It's about technology, infrastructure, and then also habits and sort of cultural norms. So, when people say I'm at a very Chinese stage in my life and they're drinking warm water because that's what people do in China because they think it's healthier,
right.
Which I believe that actually. I think ancient Chinese medicine is pretty cool. So I think there are lots of people looking at China thinking it's pretty cool. The infrastructure is amazing. The technology is cheap and, we're all using it. And, some of these traditions are pretty cool that they have. But one thing they haven't produced, which obviously the Americans did at this sort of stage of their development, was produced a bunch of celebrities, produced a bunch of really interesting cultural output. And this is what people who are Chinese and China watchers say. I don't think this is an ignorant thing to say from the outside. No. But Chinese cinema, people really complain about it.
Right.
Intellectual people who are sort of China watchers say the films are crap. And it is because the censorship means that you can't be particularly sort of creative. And they're the kind of lowest common denominator. It all has to tell a story about how great a nation China is to some degree, or not explicitly, but sort of have an undertone of the kind of message that the party wants to propound, which is quite sort of socially conservative, nationalistic, and doesn't necessarily lead to the most interesting films that everyone in the world wants to watch.
And I think it's fair to say Xi Jinping's approach has maybe got shades more of authoritarianism within it compared to some of his predecessors, pardon me. So, they're probably very wary of individuals, something becoming bigger, holding more influence than Xi, and Xi is synonymous with the CCP, right? That they're talked about as one and the same. And the kind of individualism which lends itself so well to US capitalism, it doesn't quite translate, I think, because of some of these differing values. Got to remember as well, it's fair to say, the US doesn't become as ubiquitous culturally, right from the start. It doesn't really get there maybe till the sort of mid 20th century. I was telling you earlier that I was thinking a lot about Marilyn Monroe, who would have been 100 next week. I was thinking about her as this kind of symbol of American mythology, that sort of mid 20th century emblem of American and Americana. And Marilyn Monroe is she's not really a person per se. She's an idea, and she's a very consciously put together idea. She was built on the conveyor belt of Hollywood. She is someone who is kind of made. She's not organic, right? So it would be interesting to think about, maybe ultimately we're looking at this from a Western lens where we're talking about, well, cultural hegemony means individuals, but actually maybe it doesn't. And maybe actually that the culture and values of China politically will actually just suit a different kind of political hegemony. I also think as well, just really quickly, some of it is also language.
Yeah.
So in the US, for example, they had the benefit already of the British Empire, which had already gone around spreading the English language everywhere. And so it's much easier to translate ideas and effectively propaganda. My dad, and this is, Congo's not English speaking actually, but my dad essentially got a whole load of American propaganda when he went to school. He went to a boarding school run by Americans in Congo where they all spoke English. And that was a very, useful conduit to project certain ideas about America that he then didn't find out till he left Congo, until he met my mum. Some of the, activities of the CIA and things like that. So language, I think, is also a big part of it. And that may change, of course, as potentially Chinese languages become more part of the ubiquitous culture. So later phases may mean that their cultural dominance does look more hegemonic. Last thing I'll say really quickly as well is that maybe hegemonic cultures worldwide are just over. If we're moving into a multipolar world, maybe that, different will have these kind of three spheres across the world, and China will be hegemonic in its sphere, but maybe it won't be hegemonic elsewhere. So we don't have that kind of all-encompassing cultural hegemony.
So we might have American movies, Chinese tech, Russian oil, I suppose, and European. What's Europe produce at the moment? Books, Irish literature, everyone loves.
Oh, I wouldn't mind
say that
that.
because my boyfriend's an Irish novelist, but it's true. People really do like Irish literature at the moment.
They do.
Football. Europe has football.
Yes, we do.
And loads of other stuff. People like European history, the Renaissance, all of that. Everyone's got something to offer, haven't they? On the language point, I 100% agree with you. It's relevant. The counterpoint people would put forward is Japanese manga and Korean K-pop.
Right.
So obviously the languages are equally sort of indecipherable to a Western ear.
Yeah.
And they still have managed to have some quite sort of successful exports.
I think because they don't have those same ties to this very kind of strong sense of collectivism, lack of individualism.
Well, they don't have the same censorship as you have in China.
Exactly. And really, storytelling is about individuals, really. Like it's about interesting characters, interesting people, interesting stories. That's what music and culture, in those respects is. So those things lend themselves, I think, really well. So I can understand how they're able to transcend the language barrier through those things. Maybe China should look at, exploring cinema. Let those barriers down, let people create things a bit.
Well, they did. There's sixth generation Chinese cinema, which is very, very interesting. So Long My Son is actually my favorite movie ever made. It's Chinese.
Ever, period.
I mean, it changed throughout my life, but at the moment, it's the one that I say, because it's the one that's sort of most in my mind.
Okay.
3 hours long, amazing amount.
I'll put it on my letterbox.
And a couple throughout their life, throughout sort of Chinese development over the past 30 years. So you see that in the background, but with lots of heartfelt trauma, like the love of parents. And I don't want to give anything away, but you must watch it. There is some brilliant Chinese cinema, but apparently that was before Xi Jinping kind of fucked it all up.
Right.
So the cinema has got less interesting since that.
You can't have everything.
Made.
China can't be good at everything.
True. Yeah. Maybe they should keep the censorship in place so we can continue with this sort of exportable cinema. Banseka, thank you so much for joining this evening. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. Great stuff.
Have a fantastic weekend, everyone watching. Thank you for tuning in as always. Come back on Monday for another live stream from 6 p.m. It won't be me, but you'll be in great hands, I'm sure. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.